Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Genoa City had always survived on whispers, but this time the secret clawed its way into the open like a living thing, breathing and pulsing with consequences no bone could overrun. The morning began deceptively calm, the kind of quiet that settles before a storm, when indeed the chandeliers at the Newman estate sounded to hold their breath. Nick Newman stood alone in the living room, gaping out at the grounds he'd known his entire life, feeling the weight of commodity unnamed pressing down on his casket. He'd the sense, deep in his bones, that the day would fracture the fragile balance holding his family together. He just didn't know how disastrous the break would be. News traveled presto in Genoa City, but verity moved pokily, dragging behind it times of denial, buried recollections, and choices made in despair. Matt's name had begun circulating again in hushed exchanges, spoken with unbelief and fear. A man numerous believed silenced ever had returned, not as a ghost but as a reckoning. He wasn't interested in vengeance alone. He wanted exposure. He wanted justice. And most intimidating of all, he wanted Nikki Newman's secret dragged into the light for everyone to see. Nick tried calling his mama, but her phone went straight to voicemail. That alone transferred a shiver through him. Nikki was infrequently unobtainable, especially not when pressure coddled this close to the face. He left a communication, his voice steady but edged with solicitude, prompting her to call him back as soon as she could. As he ended the call, his studies entwined to Matt and the pieces of the history that had no way relatively fit together. He flashed back the night everything apparently ended, the falsehoods that were told, the silence that followed. Back also, he trusted his parents, trusted that the verity, whatever it was, had been handled. Now that trust felt dangerously thin. Across city, Nikki sat alone in a dimly lit room, the weight of decades pressing down on her shoulders. She held a glass of water she had no intention of drinking, her hands pulsing just enough to betray her fear. The history had eventually caught up to her, and no quantum of plutocrat, influence or love could shield her from what was coming. She had lived with her sin for so long that it had come a part of her, a shadow she carried indeed on her brightest days. She'd induced herself that silence had been the only option, that guarding her family justified everything. But Matt's return shattered that vision. When Matt eventually appeared in public, it was end with theatrics. There was no dramatic press conference, no crying allegations from the rooftops. Rather, he chose perfection. He met with the people who signified most, one by one, planting seeds of mistrustfulness and letting the verity grow on its own. His first target was Nick. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of society, where the clink of spectacles and low exchanges masked the intensity of their exchange. Nick arrived guarded, his jaw set, eyes sharp with dubitation. Matt didn't desolate time. He spoke calmly, nearly clinically, laying out details only someone deeply involved could know. He talked about that night, about the fear and chaos, about Nikki's part in what happened next. As each word landed, Nick felt the ground shift beneath him. He wanted to dismiss it as manipulation, a hopeless attempt to hurt his family. But the specifics were too accurate, too precisely flashed back. Matt wasn't guessing. He was revealing. Nick's denial cracked not with wrathfulness but with pain. He demanded evidence, demanded to know why Matt was doing this now. Matt's answer was simple: he was tired of carrying the verity alone. Nikki's secret wasn't just a particular failing. It had gurgled outward, shaping lives and choices in ways no bone had completely understood. Matt said he wasn't asking Nick to turn against his mama. He was asking him to face reality. By the time Nick left society, his hands were shaking. He drove straight to the estate, every affair tensing the knot in his stomach. He set up Nikki in the living room, the same room where so numerous family battles had been fought and forgiven. She looked up as he entered, her eyes formerly wet, as if she knew exactly what he was about to say. The silence between them stretched, heavy and suffocating. Nick eventually spoke, his voice breaking despite his trouble to stay composed. He told her Matt was back. He told her he knew. He didn't charge her outright, but the recrimination hung in the air, inarguable. Nikki's countenance atrophied. Times of precisely constructed strength collapsed under the weight of her son's aspect. She confessed, not in dramatic bursts, but in quiet devastated rulings that stripped the once bare. She talked about fear, about instinct, about the moment everything went wrong. She admitted the choices she made subsequently, the falsehoods she told herself to survive. She said she believed she was guarding Nick, guarding the family, guarding a future that would have been destroyed if the verity had come out. As she spoke, Nick felt torn in two, between the woman who raised him and the reality of what she had done. Gashes streamed down Nikki's face as she reached for Nick, soliciting him to understand, to forgive her. She admitted she'd been living in terror of this day, knowing it might come but hoping it no way would. Nick pulled down, not out of abomination, but because the verity hurt too important to absorb all it formerly. He loved his mama fiercely, but love didn't abolish the graveness of her conduct. Word of the battle spread snappily, despite their sweats to keep it private. Victor Newman, the ever-vigilant primogenitor, tasted the shift incontinently. He brazened Nikki with controlled fury, his voice low but dangerous. This wasn't just about treason, it was about vulnerability. Nikki's secret hovered the entire Newman heritage, and Victor despised being exposed. Yet beneath his wrathfulness lay fear. For Nikki, for Nick, for everything he'd fought to cover. Meanwhile, Matt continued his quiet crusade. He reached out to others affected by the history, forcing them to question what they allowed. They knew. Each discussion added another crack to the facade Nikki had erected. The megacity buzzed with enterprise, alliances forming and breaking as people chose sides. Some saw Nikki as a victim of circumstance. Others saw her as a woman who crossed an insupportable line. Nick set up himself at the center of the storm, pulled in every direction. He brazened Matt again, this time with despair rather than unbelief. He prayed him to stop, to consider the damage this disclosure would beget. He contended not just as a son, but as a man who understood loss and remorse. Matt heated, authentically equivocal but unmoved. He told Nick that verity had its own instigation, and formerly set in stir, it couldn't be stopped. The emotional risk on Nick was ruinous. He slightly slept, replaying recollections of his nonage through a new lens, questioning moments he'd formerly taken for granted. Every smile from his mama now carried an echo of what she'd hidden. Yet indeed as wrathfulness burned, compassion followed near before. He saw Nikki's pain, her guilt, and it softened him in ways he didn't anticipate. The climax came when the secret eventually broke into the open, no longer confined to private competitions. In a tense gathering that brought together family and rivals likewise, Matt laid out the verity in full. Nikki stood firm as the room absorbed every word. There was no room left for denial, no murk to hide in. The sin she'd carried alone was now participated by everyone who heard it. Nick stepped forward, his voice pulsing but strong. He didn't defend the act, but he defended his mama's humanity. He spoke about love, about fear, about the insolvable choices people make when they believe everything they cherish is at threat. His words didn't vindicate Nikki, but they reminded everyone that the story wasn't black and white. In the fate, Genoa City reeled. Connections shifted, trust was tested, and the Newmans faced a future ever altered. Nikki, stripped of her secrets, began the long road toward responsibility and redemption. Matt, having achieved exposure, was left to grapple with the consequences of his verity. And Nick, caught between them, surface changed, wiser, more guarded but still driven by love. As the dust settled, one thing was clear: secrets might cover in the short term, but they always demand payment in the end. Nikki's intimidating secret had eventually been exposed, and while the injuries it left were deep, they also offered a chance. Still painful for honesty, mending, and a new morning in Genoa City. The days that followed the exposure of Nikki Newman's secret didn't move forward in a straight line. They twisted, doubled back, and collided with old injuries that had no way completely healed. Genoa City didn't explode all it formerly. Rather, it cracked sluggishly, like ice under too important weight, each fracture louder than the last. Nick tried to renew his routine, but nothing felt familiar presently. Every hallway at Newman Enterprises, every discussion with workers who had formerly looked at him with undressed respect, now carried a subcast of judgment and curiosity. People lowered their voices when he walked by. Some offered sympathetic grins. Others avoided him entirely. The Newman name, formerly synonymous with power and certainty, now came with an asterisk no bone. Dared to say audibly. At home, Nikki was in a strange limbo. She was neither forgiven nor condemned outright. Victor slightly spoke to her, choosing silence as his armament. When he did look at her, his eyes were undecipherable, which frightened Nikki further than wrathfulness ever could. She had faced Victor's wrath ahead and survived it. This was different. This was disappointment, and it cut deeper than any blameworthiness. Nikki began attending meetings with attorneys and therapists, forced to defy not only the legal counteraccusations of her once conduct but the emotional bones she had buried for decades. Each session held back another subcast of denial. She spoke of fear turning into habit, habit turning into identity. She admitted that nearly along the way survival had come defense. Saying it audibly didn't bring relief. Brought shame. Nick visited her less constantly at first, not out of atrocity, but because he demanded space to breathe. When he did come, their exchanges were conservative, fragile. They talked about mundane effects, rainfall, work, recollections of simpler times, circling around the verity like two people hysterical of touching a live line. Yet beneath every word was the implied acknowledgement that their relationship had changed ever. Matt, meanwhile, discovered that telling the verity didn't bring the peace he'd imagined. Rather of check, he set up himself insulated. Some hailed him as stalwart. Others saw him as vengeful. The lines between justice and vengeance blurred in the public eye, and Matt began to question his own motives. Had he wanted responsibility, or had he wanted Nikki to feel the same fear he formerly did? Late one night, Matt stood alone outside the Newman estate, gaping at the gates. He didn't plan to go by. He just demanded to see the place that had shaped so much of his pain. For times, he'd imagined this moment as triumphant. Rather, it felt concave. The verity was out, but the history remained unchanged. Inside the estate, Victor brazened Nick in his study. The discussion was ineluctable, and neither man wanted it. Victor spoke first, his tone establishment but controlled. He questioned Nick's fidelity, his public station, his amenability to stand beside Nikki after what she had done. Nick heeded, his jaw tight, and also responded with a calm that surprised indeed himself. He told Victor that fidelity didn't mean eyeless obedience. It meant facing the verity no matter how unattractive, and deciding what kind of family they wanted to be subsequently. He reminded his father that power without responsibility was just another form of destruction. Victor bristled at the recrimination but said nothing. For the first time, Nick saw query flicker behind his father's eyes. Away, the ripple goods spread beyond the Newmans. Old alliances shifted. People who had erected their lives around the supposition that Nikki's history was settled were forced to reassess everything. Some felt betrayed not just by Nikki, but by the silence that had defended her. Others wondered what secrets still lurked beneath Genoa City's polished face. Nick set up unanticipated support in quiet places. Exchanges with people who understood moral Argentine areas helped him reuse his own equivocal feelings. He admitted that part of him was furious that his mama had taken down his right to know the verity, furious that his life had been shaped by a taradiddle. But another part of him saw the alarmed woman behind the decision, and that compassion refused to die. Nikki, stripped of her defenses, began making small but meaningful changes. She stopped asking for remission and started fastening on responsibility. She reached out to those laterally harmed, not to explain herself but to hear. Some slammed the door in her face. Others allowed brief, painful exchanges that ended without resolution. Nikki accepted every outgrowth as justified. The most delicate moment came when Nick eventually sat down with her alone, without Victor, without attorneys, without the weight of unfollowership. He told her he loved her. Also, he told her that love didn't abolish his wrathfulness. He demanded time. He demanded honesty moving forward. And if she ever prevaricated to him again, indeed about commodities small, it would be the end of whatever trust remained. Nikki jounced, gashes falling freely. She didn't promise perfection. She promised verity. As weeks turned into months, Genoa City sluggishly acclimated to its new reality. The reproach lost its proximity, replaced by other heads and rumors, but its impact dallied. The Newman family no longer felt untouchable, And maybe that was the topmost change of all. Matt ultimately left City, not in defeat, but in quiet abdication. He'd said his piece. What came next was no longer his to control. Before leaving, he met Nick one last time. There were no pitfalls, no allegations, only a participated acknowledgement of damage done and paths chosen. They parted without remission, but without abomination. In the end, Nikki stood on the edge of commodity, strange a life without secrets. It scarified her. It also freed her. She knew redemption was ain't guaranteed, and remission might no way completely come. But for the first time in times, she faced the future without hiding from the history. Nick watched his family from a distance, apprehensive that strength was no longer about control, but about abidance. The verity had bring them dearly, but it had also stripped down visions that no longer served them. What remained was messy, painful, and real. And in Genoa City, where sins infrequently stayed buried and love frequently survived the insolvable, that reality was both a curse and a mourning. Time did what it always did in Genoa City, it softened the noise without erasing the damage. The shockwaves from Nikki's exposed sin no longer dominated every discussion, but they dallied beneath the face, shaping how people looked at one another, how trust was given, or withheld. The megacity had moved on, yet it hadn't healed. Nick felt the change most acutely within himself. The wrathfulness that formerly burned hot had cooled into commodity, heavier and more complicated. It wasn't remission, not yet. It was understanding mixed with grief for the interpretation of his mama, he allowed. He'd known. He began to realize that conciliation wasn't a moment, but a process measured in small, deliberate way. One evening, Nick returned to the estate after a long day, awaiting the familiar silence. Rather, he set up Nikki sitting at the piano. She hadn't played in times. The notes were reluctant, amiss but sorrowfully sincere. Nick stopped in the doorway, hearkening. Music had always been Nikki's retreat, the place she went when words failed her. This time she wasn't hiding. She was trying to rebuild commodity she had broken. When she noticed him, she didn't stop playing right down. She finished the piece, letting the last note hang in the air. Also she turned to him, her expression open, unguarded. She didn't apologize. She didn't explain. She simply said she was trying to flash back who she was before fear mandated every decision. Nick jounced. For the first time since the verity came out, he felt commodity shift, not relief but possibility. Victor watched these moments from a distance, floundering with his own reckoning. For a man who had erected an conglomerate on control, Nikki's secret represented a failure he couldn't undo. He realized, reluctantly, that his instinct to cover at all costs had helped produce the veritably conditions that allowed the taradiddle to survive. It was a bitter consummation, one he infrequently admitted indeed to himself. At Newman Enterprises, Nick began steering the company in a more transparent direction. Programs changed. Exchanges formerly held behind unrestricted doors were brought into the open. Some saw it as weakness. Others saw it as elaboration. Nick didn't watch which. He knew secrets had nearly destroyed his family, and he refused to let silence do the same to the business that carried their name. Nikki, meanwhile, faced a quieter battle. Alone, without the constant adrenaline of cashing, she brazened the emptiness left before. Some nights were unsupportable. Guilt crept in during the early hours of the morning, grim and sharp. But rather of deadening it, she let herself feel it. Pain, she learned, was part of responsibility. She began volunteering, not for appearances, but to base herself in commodity real. No bone. They watched about the Newman name. They watched about showing up, about hearkening, about doing the work. It lowered her. It also reminded her that redemption was erected through action, not character. Nick noticed the change gradationally. His mama spoke less, he did more. She didn't demand remission or consolation. She accepted distance without resentment. That tolerance, further than anything, began to rebuild the fragile ground between them. One autumn, Nick and Nikki participated coffee in silence, watching the world move past them. Nick eventually spoke, admitting that he still plotted with trust, that some days the treason felt fresh each over again. Nikki didn't argue. She told him mending didn't follow a straight path, and that she'd walk beside him at whatever pace he demanded. The honesty in her voice signified, In Genoa City, life continued. New dramatizations, new backstabbings, new alliances, but the assignment remained etched into its history. Nikki's intimidating secret had proven that love and detriment could attend, that good intentions didn't abolish consequences. It also proved that verity, no matter how ruinous, offered a chance to choose else. As Nick looked toward the future, he understood commodity abecedarian had changed. His family was no longer defined by perfection or power, but by adaptability. And while the scars would always remain, they served as monuments, not just of a mama's sin, but of a family's hard-earned awakening. In a megacity erected on secrets, that verity was revolutionary.